Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Meanwhile, in Washington, a debate among Republicans is kicking off on how and how much to supplement defense spending after the recent spending restraint in the debt ceiling deal negotiated by Speaker Kevin McCarthy and President Biden. Let's start with a clip of Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell on the floor Tuesday addressing this question.
The government's work to provide for the common defense remains unfinished. President Biden's request for the defense budget is simply insufficient given the major challenges that our country faces. We are investing roughly half as much in defense today as a share of GDP as we were at the height of President Reagan's buildup in the mid-1980s. In the dangerous world that surrounds us today, this is wholly inadequate.
That is a different message that is coming from the other side of the Capitol. I'll read some quotes from Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Here he is referring to the Senate. He says, "I'm not going to prejudge what some of them do, but if they think we're writing a supplemental because they want to go around an agreement we just made, it's not going anywhere." He said similar things when asked specifically about a supplemental bill to add aid to Ukraine. He said, "You first have to show what do you need money for? We've got an approps process. We're just going to work through an approps process. They're not going to circumvent what we're doing here," unquote. Kim, what is your read of this debate now taking place within the Republican Party?
Well, let's back up and just remember what happened recently with this bill that was passed to avert the debt ceiling. The House Republicans managed to get some spending reductions when it came to domestic discretionary spending. They did award more to defense. That's the other half, obviously, of the discretionary spending side. It went up to $866 billion. That was about a roughly 3% increase over last year's spending levels. By contrast, domestic discretionary is going to fall slightly closer to fiscal 2022. The problem that Republicans have, and I agree with everything that Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said there, is that this is after years of starving our military under Democratic Congresses. That 3% increase, while it is a raise, is still 2% below inflation. And the other problem is that you've got these twin pressures. Not only do we need to be engaging in a military increase in terms of our regular defense capabilities, but you also have, as we've just been talking about, external pressure to provide more money and more equipment to Ukraine. Now, the problem from the Republican side in the House is, I think, twofold. One is that there is this broad feeling that with more than $31 trillion in debt, there needs to be downward pressure on spending. That was the entire idea behind this recent bill that was passed. The other thing I think that is annoying House Republicans about this is that they're trying to change the process. And that's why you heard McCarthy say that if they want to have more money, it needs to go through the regular appropriations process. No more of these kind of, all of a sudden, we're just doing a supplemental. We'll just add 20, 30 billion here, and it won't be part of the regular appropriations process. And we can kind of pretend it almost didn't happen because it was a supplemental. They want to bring it all under the umbrella of a real appropriations process. Now, notably, I think this is important. If you listen to what McCarthy said, he didn't say you can't have it. He said that if you're going to go through the appropriations process and you want to cut elsewhere, that was certainly my reading of this. If you want to cut elsewhere and put more money into defense, go ahead. Now, can we see if the senators can do that? McCarthy just put the hard work into getting some sort of balance. He's saying that they're not just going to abandon that agreement they got to some sort of spending caps. But if Senate Republicans and Democrats can work to find some real cuts somewhere else and raise the money to increase defense spending, I think that this would go through the House. I think what he was saying is not going to happen is that they can't just sit down and say, yeah, we're going to just now toss off another $80 billion supplemental where everyone's put in all of their priorities, both discretionary domestic spending and defense spending and Ukraine spending, and kind of blow up this whole deal that the Republicans just managed to get the president to sign in the House.
But to take your number, $80 billion, if that's his position, then to add $80 billion to defense spending or to Ukraine aid requires cutting elsewhere. And anytime you cut something, you are always making some enemy in some corner, some district, some jurisdiction where that program is locally important. And so, Kim, I wonder where that leaves Speaker McCarthy and Leader McConnell as we go forward here. And particularly on the point about Ukraine, if that position will hold based on what happens here in this counteroffensive. And I guess I could argue it either way. Either the Ukrainians make some real breakthroughs and President Biden comes to Congress and says, this is the additional equipment that they need to keep rolling back this invasion, or the counteroffensive stalls and President Biden comes and says, this is the equipment that they need to get it started again so that we don't end up in a frozen conflict with Vladimir Putin in control of a big chunk of Ukraine for the foreseeable future. Do you think that there will be some pressure in Congress and maybe some movement to get that money to the Ukrainians? Or if we're just broadening this to the broader defense bill, you could see aggressive actions by China that could build some pressure as well for some broader increases, and either get some people on board with going above those caps or find the will to make those cuts, which are inevitably going to make somebody angry.
Well, the need is certainly there, and we should point that out. The Ukrainian President Zelensky recently did a pretty wide-ranging interview with the Wall Street Journal, and he noted that Ukraine desperately still needs yet more equipment from the United States, in particular Patriot missiles, which have been helping the Ukrainians to ward off these Russian missile attacks, especially on Kiev, which they've been waging at night, really shelling the city. So they need a lot more air defenses. They need a lot more of everything. And yeah, that pressure is certainly going to continue to grow, especially if they have some success with this counteroffensive and there looks like some momentum is there. I think the question for this White House, and if I were Kevin McCarthy, this is what I would be putting out there, is this White House has been very good about backing Ukraine, making the case for it, but unwilling to make any sacrifices in terms of trade-offs. They want, in essence, to be engaged in both guns and butter. They have dramatically over the last few years upped domestic discretionary spending, even if we've been sending money out the door to Ukraine. I think that they need to be asked to engage in some of those trade-offs. You saw a number of Senate Democrats, and this is good, come out on the side of saying we really do need more money for Ukraine and arguing for a supplemental. But what you don't hear any of them saying is that we need to reduce some of our spending elsewhere in order to make that possible. So I think the Republicans would be wise here, those who are security hawks, and by the way, I'm one of those, to argue a couple of things. One, that this does need to be a targeted supplemental or a targeted process within the appropriations process. So it can't be some wild-eyed number, but you need to look at what is actually needed, make the case for it, and keep that a reasonable number. And then two, be willing to give up something else. I think if you can do that, imagine the bipartisan unity, if you could get some Senate Democrats to get on board with that and say, hey, okay, we're going to roll back some of that IRS money that we put out there to pay for this Ukrainian package. Look, sure, I think you can get there. But I think that if what you have is a group of Senate Democrats and Republicans who say, we're just going to have a great big old package and fulfill our whole wish list, much as we did with omnibuses of the past or supplementals of the past, that is going to be a dead letter with House Republicans.
Jillian, what's your view of the polling here among the American electorate? And this is the top of an AP story late last month that says half of the people in the U.S. support the Pentagon's ongoing supply of weapons to Ukraine for its defense against Russian forces. That level is nearly unchanged in the past year. About a quarter are opposed to sustaining the military lifeline that has now topped $37 billion. And again, that's as of May 24. But Jillian, there's also been some interesting polling showing an uptick in Republican skepticism, a belief that this is enough, this has gone on too long.
Yeah, I think that's really unfortunate. And one interesting thing of being out here in Europe, I was just in Poland a couple of weeks ago talking to officials both in Poland and hearing from people around Eastern Europe. They are paying very close attention to these polls and some of the isolationist political undertones in the US and are extremely concerned about what this means. I do think when Russia does something really horrible, like it did in Bucha or Irpin or Izium, I think as well with the imagery coming out of this dam, you typically see an uptick in American support for Ukrainians. There's something really inspiring about the Ukrainian people being willing to fight for their freedom against an authoritarian country, being willing to not be bullied or put down. And if you talk to Ukrainians, what they say is they are very much looking at the American model. They want the freedom that Americans have, and they have that sort of American fighting spirit. So I hope that that is enough to persuade Americans. And I guess the secondary argument to that is why we have strong defense in Europe, at least. It's largely aimed at countering the threat of Russia. Right now, you have Ukrainians who are fighting and dying, and in the process, degrading that Russian threat. So I think it's a bargain for the U.S. to be supporting them.
Kim, we'll give you the last word, but this might be something that Vice President Mike Pence could add to the debate in the 2024 Republican primaries, because he has been one of the most vocal of these potential candidates on continued support for Ukraine. We are still waiting as we tape this for his official announcement, and so I'm not sure whether he will say anything about that to Iowans when he gives his speech there. But the other thing I would point out here is that these candidates are all aiming at a moving target, because those polls could also change depending on what happens on the ground. If this counteroffensive becomes successful and rolls back some of the Russian territory, maybe those polls will pick up. And by the time Republican voters start going to the polls early next year, it is hard to know what it could look like on the ground. And as a result, where the American public will be on this question.
I certainly hope Mike Pence does add something to this, because you've seen this strain in the Republican Party. It remains quite small at the moment. If you look, for instance, at House Republicans, I would say that most of them are strongly in favor of more Ukrainian aid. They'd like to see that done again within a normal appropriations process, done in a way that doesn't increase overall spending yet again. But they are favorable. You have this strain, though, of Republicans who are a little bit more populist, a little bit more isolationist. And you're seeing that expressed by some of the other Republican candidates, in particular Donald Trump, who is kind of a nonsense argument. Well, he's arguing that he wouldn't even really have to deal with this question of Ukrainian spending because he would just fix this in 24 hours if he was president. Okay, I mean, I don't even know what that means. But to have a guy like Mike Pence, who is much more in the Reagan vein of the Republican Party, who makes the argument and does it persuasively that a stronger American abroad and a stronger military defense is in fact the best way to avoid conflict and discourage conflict around the globe. I think we need to have that discussion and we need to hear that argument again, because we haven't really had it from a Republican leader for a while, and it's an important reminder. And it couldn't come, as you say, at a sooner moment, given that American tolerance for some of these activities overseas, we've never had a great reputation for sticking with it in the long run. And we're going to be having this counteroffensive. Let's hope it goes really well, because I agree with you that if there are big problems with it, you could see a loss of support of the American electorate, and that will affect politics in its own right.
Thank you, Kim and Jillian. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.